Content advisory. This story touches on emotional abuse, corporate harm, miscarriage, and suicide. It treats those themes with restraint and focuses on accountability and healing. If you stay until the end and this story moves you, consider subscribing and leaving a like. It helps others find stories that matter. The champagne flutes caught the skyline like fragments of a broken mirror. From the penthouse terrace, the city unrolled in a smear of light. Office towers, a river of taxis, a neon promise that everything could be bought or fixed with the right sum. Lucas Marshall stood with a glass in his hand and a smile that had been practiced in boardrooms longer than any shirt he owned. Around him, laughter creased the expensive clothes, and the conversation sounded like wind over cut crystal, quick, gleaming, shallow. Jack Rowan nudged him, a grin that always arrived an instant before a provocation. "You ever get bored, Lucas? Of winning?" Lucas considered the question as one might consider a new suit, necessary, expected. Bored? Never. He lifted his glass. Winning is the occupation. That's the problem. Jack tilted his head toward the crowd and toward the woman who had not yet noticed the attention. "You need stakes, something real. Entertain us." The woman, Chloe Richards, moved like someone who owned the room despite not asking for the deed. She was in a black dress that suggested someone could both be unapproachable and utterly present. She declined the champagne when offered. She refused to be impressed. When she finally turned, she met Lucas's smile with an unreadable expression, like a game piece placed precisely on a chessboard. Jack's voice dropped to conspiratorial volume. "I'll make you a wager. You get her to marry you for 6 months. Contract, public, prove she can be tamed. I'll put 100,000 on it." Laughter bubbled around the terrace. People liked spectacle. They liked bets because bets absolved them of responsibility for outcomes. Lucas heard the terms and felt the familiar click of a lock falling into place. He imagined the scoreboard in his head, reputation enhanced, a new notch of conquest. He imagined, too, the headline parties and the smug messages from rivals who would swallow their pride. Chloe listened long enough for the cheapness of the idea to decorate her face in the mildest of contempt. "You think marriage is a prize?" she asked, and her voice was small enough that only the nearest could hear, but large enough that Lucas felt the question as an accusation. "That's not what marriage is." "Not everyone thinks so," Jack said, too quick with his defense. "Not everyone plays to win with the heart on the line." Chloe's eyes found Lucas. "Suppose I accept," she said, "on my terms. 6 months, 1 public ceremony, a contract. But it will be explicit. No annulment, no backdoor escape clauses, and full public disclosure." Her smile was a hinge that moved without giving away whether it would open or close. The terms were varnished with arrogance and curiosity. Lucas agreed with the same casual vigor he applied to acquisitions. He signed the mock contract, an arrangement drawn up in the spirit of a dare, and the room erupted. The bet entered the air like a perfume that would linger long after the guests had gone home. He had not expected Chloe to be anything but graceful theater. He had not expected to feel tugged by something that was not conquest, but curiosity. He thought of the game. He was the player who always saw 3 moves ahead. The notion of winning someone by design appealed to a neat corner of his mind that measured outcomes and delighted in their certainty. He did not know yet that certainty would begin to erode the instant Chloe stopped playing the role he had assigned. Their wedding was a spectacle in miniature. An ornate contract, a city ceremony attended by the usual cluster of friends and cameras. Chloe moved through it like a diplomat at an uneasy truce. People called it a stunt. Magazines called it entertaining. Lucas bought gifts that cost more than the small restaurants where Chloe had once eaten. He booked private tables facing the river, sent bouquets of peonies, her name in seasonal bloom, left by the door in the kind of abundance that was meant to acclimate the heart to surrender. Chloe accepted the gifts, but did not surrender. She set boundaries in small acts that stung with clarity.
She kept some evenings unbooked, refused to be displaced by parties, and sent back a suit Lucas bought with a single, dispassionate message: "I appreciate the thought, I won't wear it." Lucas learned to interpret silence the way he had once read market reports. At first, he thought he could invest his way past the wall she had up. He scheduled trips that glittered in brochures, charters with tailored itineraries, private galleries where he expected declinations of necessity to turn into shared delight. When she declined, he was puzzled. When she rebelled with coolness, he felt a fissure in his understanding of influence. The trouble took shape not as a thunderclap, but as method. Where his offers were extravagant, Chloe's refusals were precise and public enough to sting his image. She spoke in meetings of independence, corrected a friend who called her Lucas's trophy with a laugh that had no humor. She made appointments without him. She accepted clients who were inconvenient for Lucas's schedule and followed through with a competence that cost him the narrative of control. It escalated in subtler ways. Lucas found himself attempting to direct her time, suggesting attendance at events when she preferred quiet, inventing calendar conflicts that would prevent her from seeing old friends, telling close aides to prioritize his calls. His intent, when he examined it privately, was to create a life that folded neatly around him.
Control is a quiet thing. It is a glass that reflects back exactly what you expect to see. Chloe's resistance was not accidental. She had reasons that did not fit the neatness of a Scandal magazine column. She had cultivated a life that was anchored in a history she rarely spoke of. One evening in a small cafe with rain-threaded windows, she told him the story she had kept locked. Lucas listened from the room that belonged to his private bewilderment. He had thought the worst of her had been pride or vengeance. He had imagined cleverness and a brilliant acting of pain. He had not been prepared for the ledger of real harm. "My father lost everything," she said, and the words arrived like a door closing on a corridor that had kept its secrets. "His company folded because of a takeover my father trusted, told to believe in a future that was engineered by people who knew the numbers would kill the smaller creditors. They were sustained at the top, and he was left with nothing. He couldn't rebuild. She stopped, fingers tightening around a chipped cup. She did not dramatize, she did not offer detail. The meaning was there with quiet force. Lucas's first reaction was irritation. How could she draw a line like that? It was an irritation that had always led him to pursue. But as she continued, she revealed what truly ruined him. A calculated corporate strategy that had prioritized shareholder returns and heatless efficiencies, and had been executed, in part, by the firm where Lucas's ascent had been honed. Names were not needed, the structure was enough. Her father's life had been consumed by a sequence of decisions and cancellations that, strung together, led him to a place where he felt there was no future. Chloe chose her words with the precision of someone who had rehearsed restraint for years. "And that's not even the worst of it," she said softly. "I was pregnant then. I'd been keeping it, quiet, terrified. After the crash, after the legal fights, my health faltered. I lost the baby. I didn't tell him." She looked at Lucas as if she had opened a safe and let him see the single document inside. The confession landed without spectacle. It carried with it an economy of grief that suggested months, not moments, of private mourning. The room in his chest rearranged itself. He had always imagined his dealings as transactions. They were clean, objective. This was not a line on a spreadsheet, but a life torn from a woman who had to carry absence, and then the knowledge that those who had engineered the deal had continued their ascent without regard. After Chloe's disclosure, Lucas felt something akin to vertigo. It was less about guilt in the abstract and more about the sudden clarity of consequence. Before that evening, the harm had been diffuse, a new metric to evaluate a past action. Now it had a face and a history and a wound that did not accept his carefully tailored apologies. He tried apology at first.
Words felt insufficient. He discovered they were also transparent. He arranged for an accountant to examine past transactions, ordered a quiet internal review, bought time by promising structural changes at his company. Chloe watched him with a face that had learned to be skeptical of performative repentance. The world expected a cascade, the showy mea culpa, the press release, the social absolution. She had seen that before. Instead, she offered punishment measured like a set of chess moves. She did not scream or make a spectacle, she chose to dismantle Lucas's certainty. She ignored his texts with a surgical patience. She undermined his calendar, accepting an invitation to a charity dinner the day before a pivotal shareholder vote, hosting a client in his absence. She never explained in public, she let his circle construe it as slippage, as the brittle social currency of anyone who leaned too heavily on power. She fed him a slow and deliberate loss of control, of illusions. Lucas's descent was not cinematic. It was a series of nights where light from the skyline fell across the glass of his apartment and he could not sleep. He stopped answering some calls because his voice betrayed his shame. He tried to mobilize the old methods, hiring an investigative firm to trace Chloe's past in order to find the real motives he could counter, but the more he dug, the more he found that he had been implicated not by a single callous decision, but by a culture of choices he had benefited from and perpetuated. Shame is a kind of light that reveals the architecture you built without noticing the cracks. He began to visit the neighborhoods where the consequences had been most visible. He went to a modest house on the edge of town where a woman with a tired face opened the door with the caution of someone who had learned to limit hope. He sat at a kitchen table and watched a child color outside the lines. He listened as stories came. Names of suppliers who had been stretched thin, of clinics closed because of budget reallocations, of men and women whose dreams were cornered away. He did not try to smoothen these accounts with corporate jargon. He let them stand. Repentance, Lucas discovered, required attention that was practical and relentless. He offered funds to establish a scholarship in memory of Chloe's father, but she refused the ostentation of donation as penance. He created a task force to audit the firm's practices, but he knew action without oversight could be another form of vanity. What had started as a public relations problem for him became, quietly, a chore of restoration. He hired a compliance officer with teeth, restructured deals so that small creditors would be considered, and personally visited families who had been hurt. The visits were clumsy at first. He did not know how to say he was sorry without sounding rehearsed, but his presence, sustained, began to matter. He tried to apologize to Chloe in other ways. A letter left at her door with no witness, coffee at dawn when she was still on her way to the studio where she taught workshops, a bouquet of peonies laid on the stoop. Some saw these as gestures meant to buy forgiveness. Others would have laughed at the idea that anything could be purchased. But the repetition of small, unglamorous acts began to erode the armored neatness of his previous self. He stopped sending the expensive gifts when he realized they were designed to silence people rather than honor them. He learned to show up without agenda. Chloe's campaign of punishment shifted as well. It was never cruel. Cruelty plays for spectacle. Instead, she gave him the currency of presence, testy, withheld, conditional. She watched him via the slow calculus of time. When he repaired one contract to include protections for smaller vendors, when he fired executives who had been principal actors in the reckless deals, she took note. When he visited the families and listened rather than spoke, when he accepted the small, humiliating tasks, organizing records, attending town meetings, learning names, she observed the shift. There were setbacks. A press release promised reform, and then a vendor filed grievances. Lucas had to grapple with the mechanisms that perpetuated harm beyond his original decisions. People he had worked with for years felt betrayed by his new direction. He lost clients who preferred the old, efficient ruthlessness. He lost friends who had been comrades in the ascent. He found, to his ticklish surprise, that the losses hurt less than he had expected, because the old currency of admiration was being exchanged for something sturdier and more fragile: trust. At his lowest point, Lucas sat on the penthouse terrace and watched rain make vertical lines on the glass.
He realized that he had been building his life in a single register, visible success, and it had masked his inability to value the private and essential things. He could not undo the past. What he could do was be present now. He imagined the child Chloe had lost, and it was no longer a figure in an account, but a human absence that had anchored her subsequent choices. The meaning of repair expanded from ledger to neighbor to memory. Chloe, in a rare scene of solitude, allowed herself to be tender enough to remember what she had once wanted. In a dim apartment that smelled faintly of coffee and old paperbacks, she touched peonies placed in a vase, not as a concession to Lucas, but as a small reconciliation with the possibility of beauty. Her grief had been a quiet companion, and her anger a protective geometry. She watched Lucas's attempts with an eye that catalogued sincerity and performance. The line that separated them was not forgiveness or its absence, it was trust, the slow architecture of watching someone choose differently again and again. Months passed in a sequence that felt like learning a new language.
Lucas canceled a major meeting to attend a community hearing. He sat in a room where people spoke painful truths without the advantage of applause. He refused a lucrative contract that would have repeated the script of the past because it would have disenfranchised small partners for a marginal increase in profit. He found himself in the company of those he had once only observed from his office window. The skyline from the penthouse no longer offered certainties about satisfaction. It presented, instead, the constancy of distance and the need to traverse it. Chloe's punishment softened not because he had given an impressive speech, but because she watched him dismantle his own comforts. He took down framed awards in his office and replaced them with photographs of the communities affected by the deals he had signed. He committed to funding mental health resources in a town that had suffered losses and did not announce the gift. When she found out, months later, it mattered because it was not a headline, it was a quiet redirection. The turning point came on a cool, clear day when Lucas walked with Chloe to a modest park where a small memorial stood. It was not flashy, a bench, an inscription, a photograph. They had arranged to meet with a woman who had been close to Chloe's father. Lucas had prepared to be rehearsed. He had practiced his apology like a legal statement until the words lost their shape. But in the moment, confronted with the honest ache of a daughter's loss, he faltered into humility. He spoke, haltingly, without pretense. "I can't change what happened," he said, "but I can listen. I can and I will do better." Listening meant more than words. He organized funds to support small businesses risked by forced consolidations. He introduced policy changes at his firm that required impact reports for every major acquisition. He created an independent board to evaluate deals on social grounds. None of it washed away the past, but each decision made visible the difference between intent and impact, between apology and action. Chloe watched him. She was not immediately softened. She was careful because softness without safety is a betrayal. But she was willing to let him cross closer to her edge. She accepted the offer to attend a community meeting beside him, where he did not speak much but listened more than she had ever seen him do. There, in the hum of ordinary lives and ordinary suffering, she saw a man who had finally taken on the weight of his choices, not as an abstract concern, but as a day-to-day practice. Their reconciliation did not arrive like a curtain falling, dramatic and total. It came in small instances: a canceled dinner in favor of an hour listening to an elderly vendor, a hand that reached across a coffee table in a silence that was not empty but shared. Chloe allowed him to be present on terms that were mutual rather than submissive. She forgave incrementally, because trust had to be rebuilt, not with a single grand gesture, but by 1,000 modest ones. They remarried, not out of spectacle, but from a private desire to mark a commitment that had been earned. In a small ceremony, away from cameras, they stood in a modest chapel, bathed in late light. Peonies were there, in muted blooms. The vows they exchanged were not theatrical promises, but gentle agreements to accountability, to speak when hurt, to ask when uncertain, to prioritize intact dignity. The wedding was a private covenant rather than a trophy. Not long after, Chloe became pregnant again.
The news arrived in a moment of quiet, an ordinary morning where light filtered through blinds and smell of toast braided with the hum of the city. They held the news like something fragile. Lucas, who had once measured life in terms of acquisition, now measured it in terms of presence. He moved through scans and checkups with a nervous attention that felt wholly new. For Chloe, the pregnancy carried the weight of possibility mingled with memory. She guarded it with a fierce, tender precision. The birth came on a night that had been humid and still. There was no drama in the house where she labored. There was instead the concentrated noise of effort and breath. When their son came into the world, the first sound he made was a small, stubborn cry. They held him, two adults who had traveled their own deserts, and they named him in a language of quiet hope. The prognosis was not immediate. In the hours after birth, doctors spoke in careful tones. A trembling word, blind, arrived like a stone dropped into a pond. The tests were clinical and precise, nothing graphic, only a measured assessment that their son would not see the world the way most do. It was a moment that might have frayed them, could have reopened the ledger of past losses, but it did the opposite. For Lucas, it reframed everything. There are intimacies that begin in crisis and then find form in routine. Caring for a blind newborn altered the coordinate system of their lives. Night feedings became lessons in tactile language. Lucas learned to navigate the nursery by touch. The texture of a blanket, the specific way a tiny hand curled around a finger. Chloe taught him to listen in ways he had never been trained. The silence of vision was replaced by an amplification of other senses. The cadence of breath, the warmth of a cheek, the smell of milk, the pattern of a tiny body adjusting to motion. Their son, named Jonah, without ceremony but with deep tenderness, taught Lucas what truly matters in life. It was not an abstract lesson, but a string of practical daily truths. Presence mattered more than proclamation. Humility mattered more than pride. Patience, the kind that did not see immediate returns, was now a practice with its own rewards. When Jonah reached for a rattle, Lucas learned to respond without calculation. When Jonah fell into a sleep that needed a steadying hand, Lucas learned the exact pressure that soothed. These were not heroic acts. They were ordinary, relentless devotion. Chloe watched him. She had given permission to love again because she had seen that he could bear the weight of accountability. Now she watched him in the small domestic trials, the midnight lullabies, the patient instruction as Jonah learned to navigate his space by texture and sound. Lucas became a man who measured success in steadiness. He sat on the nursery floor for hours, tracing the hem of a rug to show Jonah boundaries. He whispered the names of people who might one day form the network that would support their son as he navigated a world not built for him. Out of the necessity of care, their marriage deepened. Lucas continued his work reforming corporate culture, but the measure of his mornings had shifted. He no longer assessed days by deals closed, but by whether he had been present for Jonah's first laugh, for Chloe's small triumphs, for the people he had harmed who were now helped by programs he had initiated. The skyline from the penthouse still glowed, but the glow had become a backdrop rather than the main event. Jonah's blindness did not become a moral fantasy. There was no miraculous curing sweep. Instead, the boy grew into a life rich with meaning. He had a way of greeting the world that valued sound and presence. He taught Lucas, daily, to set aside the compulsion to fix and to embrace the humility of learning alongside another human. People who had known Lucas only in the context of boardrooms had to reconcile the man they had seen with the father who could sit for an hour molding Play-Doh into shapes whose names he had to speak aloud to himself. There were hard days. There were administrative battles, and nights when Lucas would be called to handle urgent corporate decisions that clattered against the quiet rhythms of home. But the balance he struck was different. He canceled the meeting more often than he once would have. He defended his priorities, not from pride, but from love. He taught his company that work mattered, but not at the expense of dignity, both the dignity of employees and the dignity of customers harmed by thoughtless mergers. In time, Chloe's bruised places softened into places where new life had taken root. She saw in Lucas not a reformed image conjured for spectacle, but a man whose small acts carried the weight of an inner change. She saw him sit in community meetings not as a sponsor, but as someone who listened and learned. He watched him teach Jonah to tap a rhythm and to find a path that was made of hands and voices and the soft memory of a father's presence. The son born blind became their compass. He had not been a resolution to past harm. He was not balm that erased the ledger. He was, instead, a persistent, loving demand to live rightly in the small daily ways that build dignity. The attentions, the apologies practiced without grandstanding, the patience that could outlast quarterly reports. Lucas learned that restitution was not only about restitution funds or policy changes. It was about what one did when no one watched, how one adjusted a schedule to make a school play, how one canceled a lucrative meeting to be the hand that steadied a child. Months later, at a small celebration, no cameras, only close friends and the family who had been present during the scandals, they watched Jonah reach for a peony petal and crumple it between two fingers, delight evident in the small shrug of his body. Chloe laughed, and Lucas caught his own breath, as if the air had been rearranged for the better. He remembered the terrace where the skyline had once been a promise of everything he thought mattered. Now, on the kitchen floor, he saw instead a tiny hand, a peony's texture, and the steadying shape of a life rebuilt. He had learned to be accountable without surrendering his responsibility to act. He had learned that forgiveness could be asked for and not owed, that repentance meant changing patterns rather than arranging ceremonies. He had learned, with a stubbornness that matched his old ambition, that a life measured by presence and repair was a life worth winning. When he sat with Chloe in the soft dusk, Jonah asleep in his arms, he traced the line of his son's cheek and felt how much smaller his own world had become and how vastly fuller. The skyline still reflected in the windows, but it was glass, transparent now, something that let light through rather than shutting it out. They had come almost all the way around a hard geometry, from a wager to a wedding to accusation to punishment to repair and finally to a life that was quieter and truer. Lucas had been taught, by a son who had never seen him, what truly mattered in life. The weeks that followed were measured in ordinary rituals rather than headlines. The foundation that Lucas had promised to create, an awkward, earnest name that he and Chloe had deliberated over in the kitchen while Jonah batted at a spoon, began to take shape. It did not arrive as a tidy remedy. It arrived as an address with a rented office above a laundromat, a skeleton staff of people who believed in restitution for reasons that had nothing to do with stock performance, and a modest roster of programs: legal clinics for families harmed by the company's past policies, scholarships for employees displaced by mergers, and an initiative to fund sensory play spaces for children with visual impairments. Lucas learned again the stubbornness of bureaucracy at the human scale. Grants were slow, vendors were unreliable, meetings stretched into evenings.
The work required a humility that was not merely moral but practical, listening to experts, deferring to mothers who had lived the consequences of his decisions, ceding platform when their voices needed to be heard. There were nights when he walked home from the office and felt the old pulse of ambition throb beneath his ribs, impatient and hungry. He breathed and let it pass. The urgency he had once given to quarterly targets now belonged to the task of steadying someone else's life. At the company, the changes he had pushed for metastasized awkwardly. A new ethics committee took shape with rotating seats for employee representatives. A customer advocacy office was established, staffed by people who answered calls in the middle of the night. Policies were rewritten to include harm assessments. Contracts were to be evaluated not only for profitability, but for human cost. Some of these reforms were sincere and slow, others were performative gestures cynically dressed as progress. Lucas had to learn to differentiate between the two, to call out superficiality without turning every critic into an enemy. Not everyone accepted the new order. A cluster of directors, men who had been his allies through years of hostile takeovers and late-night strategy sessions, bristled.
They spoke in terms of fiduciary duty and market confidence, of the risks of setting precedents that competitors could weaponize. When Lucas proposed that a percentage of executive compensation be tied to measurable social impact, one of them accused him of sabotaging shareholder value. There were muttered rumors of a vote of confidence. There were late emails suggesting he recenter his priorities, or else. Chloe watched the pressure in his face the way she had once watched an athlete track a finish line. Anxious at first, then quietly certain he could cross it, then afraid of what he might sacrifice to do so. She knew Lucas well enough to see the calculus happening behind his eyes. The old instinct to defend, to marshal facts and figures and allies. The new instinct to answer simply, to speak to the people whose lives had been bruised. When she held him awake at night with a hand at the small of his back, she said little. Once, in the dim after Jonah's breathing had evened out, she asked the question she had feared. If they take everything down to nothing, if they take the title, the money, will you still choose this? He did not give a practiced answer. He told her instead about the peony petal, about the small shrug of Jonah's body when he discovered texture. Those moments, he said, make the ledger different. He meant it literally and not. Repair, he had learned, was not a transaction, it was an orientation. If the world wanted to punish him, then punishment would be met with work. If it demanded a reckoning, then he would give one. But he would not excuse himself with platitudes, nor would he hide behind them.
When the vote finally came, it arrived not as sudden rupture, but as the culmination of weeks of unease. The boardroom was bright and sterile that morning, a long table polished like an altar to past triumphs. Lawyers flanked men and women who had known Lucas when he still measured mornings by market movements. He had prepared remarks, a careful outline of commitments and timelines, but when he stood to speak, his voice found a different register. Less of the polished executive, more of a person who had watched his life reorient itself. He spoke plainly about failures. He named specific decisions that had led to harm, not as theatrical confession, but as a map of causality. He asked the board to remove the secrecy that had allowed bad choices to compound. He proposed open audits. He offered to step aside from the CEO role if that step would accelerate the company's transformation into an institution that could live up to the promises he had made. I accept accountability, he said. If my removal frees the company to become what it should be, then I will step down. There was a stunned pause. Then negotiations began in earnest. Some directors saw advantage in his offer, a chance to ring-fence potential liabilities and restore investor confidence. Others resented the spectacle of it. In the end, the resolution that passed was neither complete surrender nor vindication. Lucas would relinquish the title of CEO, but remain in the company in a newly created role, Chief Steward of Social Integration, charged with overseeing reparative programs and community partnerships. He would receive a smaller salary and have no unilateral control over acquisitions. The company would publish a quarterly report audited by an independent third party. A portion of his stock was reallocated to seed the foundation. It was not penance dressed up as victory. It was, he understood, a complicated compromise, a public rearrangement of power that left both wounds and openings. He could have fought for a different outcome and perhaps held on to the trappings of authority. He chose instead the slower route, one that might, he hoped, endure. Outside the boardroom, the coverage was mixed. Some op-eds lauded the move as responsible and principled, others called it theater. The people whose lives had been hurt by his company's decisions watched with skepticism. A few sent terse emails, their tone cash-scarred and raw. Lucas answered each of them, sometimes with a handwritten note that left them surprised by its intimacy. He learned the cadence of humility that was not performative, brief, earnest, actionable. Chloe kept her place at his side, but she did not take the move as proof of redemption. "Don't mistake punishment for repair," she said once, late as they unpacked a box of Jonah's clothes.
Let it be the occasion for work, not the end of it. And so they worked.
The Foundation's first community partner was a modest school across the river where children with visual impairments had been gathering in makeshift classrooms. The opening was not staged for press. There were no gold scissors. Lucas found himself kneeling at the side of a table as volunteers placed tactile paths across foam mats. He watched Jonah, who had become practiced at taking in space by hand and sound, explore a model street. Curbs, a tiny mailbox, a painted crosswalk whose ridged surface gave him information through his fingertips. A boy named Mateo, who had arrived with a mother whose smile was sharpened by years of advocating for her child, took Jonah's hand. The two boys shared a small, solemn understanding, peers learning the world together, unafraid. Lucas stood back and felt a tremor of something that might have been relief. Not everyone was satisfied. An investigative reporter from a national outlet dug into the details of past deals, finding contractual corners that had been pushed so tightly they frayed. For a week, the Foundation's modest office was besieged by calls asking for comment. Lucas answered interviews with a steady voice, insisting on transparency and on the importance of listening to those harmed. It felt to him less about reputation than about the practical obligation to fix structural wrongs. And yet, the public theater of it kept brushing against the private work he and Chloe did at home. Chloe, who had been cautious in the early months about allowing cameras into their life, now became a steady presence at meetings and community events. She refused offers to make her story the centerpiece of a campaign. "We don't need spotlight caregiving," she said. "We need sustained systems." She pushed the Foundation to fund training for paraprofessionals, to build affordable adaptive toys, to create a network that connected parents in the same situation. She also advocated for legal aid. Someone had to address the consequences of past corporate behavior not only by public relations but by the law. Their marriage, tempered in the fires of scandal and repair, was not unscarred. There were resentful silences and near violations of old habits. Times when Lucas defaulted to a defense instead of an apology. Times when Chloe's patience shortened. But the architecture of their life had changed. They were now more likely to call one another in the middle of the day with updates on a child's therapy session than to trade market analyses. They had built rituals that bound them. Saturday mornings where they walked Jonah through the neighborhood park, teaching him the rhythm of footsteps and the echo of bird calls. Evenings when they read aloud tactile picture books, taking turns to describe texture and tone. Jonah, for his part, grew into a boy who had a discipline of delight. He discovered that sound could be a world unto itself, and he learned the names of things by the way people said them.
He could identify visits by the hollow rattle of a vase. He developed a repertoire of gestures, tapping a rhythm to indicate joy, pressing a palm to someone's cheek to ask a question that made the house into a place anyone could enter. He was not a cure for any ledger or for any sin. He was, as he had always been, a person whose existence refused to reduce the world's complexities into simple absolutions. On a gray afternoon several months after the Foundation's launch, Chloe arranged a small party at the school for families who had participated in the new programs. There were acoustic instruments, paper banners made with raised paint, and food that warmed the room with scent. Lucas moved through the crowd with a nervous humility. He accepted thanks without leaning on it as vindication. A woman named Aisha, who had lost a job because of a policy Lucas had defended, came to him with a cup of tea. She gave him a look that was neither forgiving nor unforgiving. It was measured, like someone weighing the weight of an action to see if it fit in her hands. "You did what you said you would do," she told him. "Now let's see if it lasts." It was less a judgment than a charge. He nodded. That night, on the short ride back to the apartment, Lucas thought about permanence. He thought about the scaffolding he had helped erect at work and how easily scaffolding could be taken down. He thought about the contracts and the numbers and the risk that everything he had started could be undone by indifferent regulators or a change in mood on Wall Street. He also thought about Jonah's small hands, the peony pedal, the many quotidian ways to show up.
The two anxieties, fragility of institution and intimacy of family, did not cancel each other. They braided. When he walked into the apartment, Jonah ran to him with a small box wrapped in crepe paper. "For Daddy," the boy announced, breathless with the triumph of giving. Inside was a sculpture of clay, a crude but earnest likeness of a tower. Lucas recognized the gesture at once, the tower of his old ambitions. Jonah had pressed textures into the sides, a line of grooves that his fingers loved to trace. Lucas took the clay tower and felt the lightweight truth of it. He could have reclaimed the corporate tower, he realized, but the one he wanted to build now would have different materials: patience, apology, repair, daily attendance. He set the tower on the shelf above the kitchen counter where the skyline once dominated their view. It was small and imperfect, and by his estimation, durable in the one way that mattered. It was made daily. As winter edged toward the city, invitations arrived, some formal, some tentative, for him to speak about accountability and corporate ethics. He accepted a few, not to rehabilitate his public image, but to insist on practices he believed might limit future harm: transparency clauses, employee representation on governance bodies, mandatory impact assessments.
In one small university lecture hall, a woman from the audience asked him whether he believed in second chances. He looked at her and thought of Jonah, of the work of a life that bends toward repair rather than spectacle. "Not as a destination," he said, "but as a practice. We practice accountability every day." The practice would be tested again. A former executive whose schemes had been central to earlier harm resurfaced in the press claiming he had been scapegoated, that decisions had been collective, and that Lucas had played no lone role. There were renewed calls to re-examine settlements and reopen files. Old adversaries smelled sport. The company's stock wavered. The foundation's donors hesitated. It was, for a moment, as if the past had reasserted its appetite. Lucas met the storm the way he had learned to meet most storms, not with grand gestures, but with a steady litany of small, honest acts. He opened the company's internal records to an independent auditor. He invited dissenting voices into panels to ask hard questions. He funded community oversight groups that could scrutinize the new programs. When the former executive demanded a public debate, Lucas accepted the invitation not to vindicate himself, but to model an evidentiary conversation. He presented documents, witness statements, and, perhaps most importantly, the unvarnished account of what he had thought and why he acted. It was not a triumphant exoneration. It was a public exercise in admission. Some nights, after difficult hearings or long days at the foundation, Lucas would come home and find Jonah asleep with his finger curled around a tiny car. He would sit in the dark and trace the line of his son's forehead, feeling the slow accrual of ordinary love. Those minutes were not a shield against consequence. They were the reason to accept them. He had chosen to be accountable precisely because it oriented him toward a family he loved and a community he had harmed. And so the work continued, steady and stubborn. Some people forgave him quickly, some never did. Some of the programs flourished, others failed and were revised. The foundation learned to be patient with itself, implementing pilot studies, shifting resources when outcomes proved disappointing, refusing to rest on the laurels of gestures. Lucas accepted that the path ahead would be messy, an ongoing negotiation between public responsibility and private fidelity. On an ordinary afternoon, months later, the three of them, Lucas, Chloe, Jonah, took Jonah to the riverfront where, years before, Lucas had walked alone, the city skyline like a promise that belonged to him. They found a bubbled patch of grass and sat. Jonah, now steadier, let Lucas hold his hand as they listened to the water. A busker played a tin whistle, the notes ricocheting in the cold air. Jonah hummed along, a small, sure sound. Chloe leaned into Lucas and whispered, "We're not finished," as if reminding him and the world both. "No," he said. "We're not." And in that admission, there was a clearness he had not expected.
that repair is ongoing, that restitution is a practice and a project, and that the deepest measure of a life is not what it acquires, but what it returns. He looked at Jonah, at Chloe, at the river moving slow and steady, and felt the logic of his life rearranged, not by victory or defeat, but by a persistent fidelity to small, humble acts. When they rose to go, Jonah padded ahead with a confidence born of being steadied. Lucas watched the boy walk and thought of every meeting he had missed to be present, every apology he had offered without theatrics, every policy he had rewritten. The skyline gleamed in the distance, a backdrop now to the daily work of living rightly. There were more hearings to come, more programs to staff, more people to listen to, more nights when he would be tempted to revert to the old reflexes of defense. But there were also dinners and small sculptures and evenings when Jonah would clap at a rhythm his father tapped. And these, Lucas knew, with a steadiness that had been hard-earned, were the measures that mattered most. They walked home together into the thin evening, the tower of clay visible on their shelf through the window, a quiet testimony to a life rebuilt one tactile, patient day at a time.